You tell the truth in meetings and watch as your ideas get dismissed while more diplomatic colleagues get promoted. Every time you speak honestly about problems or challenges, you're labeled as negative or difficult, while those who smile and nod their way through obvious issues rise through the ranks. I am Niccolò Machiavelli, the political philosopher who spent centuries being villainized for revealing the brutal truths about power and success that others were afraid to speak. What I discovered about the strategic use of truth and deception will transform how you navigate your career, showing you exactly when honesty serves you and when it destroys everything you've worked for. The same principles that guided princes and rulers through treacherous political waters can guide you through the equally dangerous waters of modern workplace politics. But first, like this video, subscribe for more politically astute wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready to learn the real rules of advancement. When I first entered the service of the Florentine Republic in 1498, I carried with me the naive belief that honest counsel would be rewarded and that speaking truth to power was not just my duty, but my path to advancement. I was 29 years old, ambitious, and convinced that my intelligence and integrity would shine through the murky waters of Renaissance politics. How wrong I was. The diplomatic seal of Florence became my symbol of authority, but it also became my first lesson in the dangerous game of truth-telling. Within weeks of my appointment as second chancellor, I witnessed the fall of men far more experienced than my self-advisors, who had served the Republic faithfully for decades, only to find themselves exiled, or worse, for delivering unwelcome news. I remember the morning when Francesco Valori, one of our most respected diplomats, was called before the Signoria to report on his mission to France. He had been instructed to secure French support for Florence's territorial disputes, but King Louis XII had refused our entreaties. Valori stood before the assembled leaders and delivered his report with unflinching honesty. France would not support us. Our position was weak, and our enemies were gaining strength. The silence that followed was not the silence of contemplation, but of condemnation. Within a month, Valori found himself stripped of his position and banned from holding public office. His crime was not incompetence or corruption, it was telling the truth when comfortable lies would have served better. This was my awakening. I realized that in the world of power, truth is not a virtue to be celebrated, but a weapon to be wielded with precision. The men who thrived in Florence's corridors of power were not those who spoke with greatest honesty, but those who understood the delicate art of selective revelation. They knew when to illuminate and when to obscure, when to confirm and when to redirect. I began to study these survivors, these masters of political navigation. They possessed a quality that pure honesty could never provide: the ability to maintain their influence while serving the greater good. They understood that sometimes protecting your position was the only way to protect your principles. The lesson carved itself into my mind like words etched in marble. Truth-telling without strategy is not nobility, is career suicide. From that moment forward, I would learn to be honest in service of larger purposes, not as an end in itself. My education in the strategic use of truth reached its zenith when I was sent to observe Cesare Borgia, the Duke of Valentinois, during his campaign to unite the Romagna. I carried with me the expectation that I would witness either the rise of a tyrant or the fall of an ambitious fool. Instead, I discovered something far more complex and infinitely more instructive. Caesar's dagger became my symbol for what I learned in those months, not because he ruled through violence alone, but because he understood that the threat of force, carefully calibrated and strategically revealed, was far more powerful than force itself. But it was his mastery of truth and deception that truly set him apart from other would-be conquerors. I watched him meet with the lords of the Romagna, men who had spent decades fighting amongst themselves, laying waste to their territories and impoverishing their people. In these meetings, Caesar never lied outright, but he revealed different aspects of truth to different audiences. To the Lord of Amilla, he spoke of the prosperity that would come from unified trade routes. To the Lord of Fork, he emphasized the military protection a larger confederation could provide. To each, he offered a vision that was both honest and incomplete. The brilliance lay not in what he said, but in what he chose not to say. He never told the Lord of Amilla that unification might mean reduced autonomy. He never explained to the Lord of Fork that military protection would come at the cost of independent foreign policy. Each truth was accurate, but none was complete. When resistance emerged from those who saw through his partial revelations, Caesar's response was swift and decisive. But here again, he demonstrated the strategic use of honesty. After eliminating his opposition at Senegalia, he publicly acknowledged his actions. He did not try to hide behind justifications or blame others. Instead, he framed his honesty as evidence of his reliability. When Cesare Borgia made a promise or a threat, it would be kept. I realized that what many called Caesare's cruelty was actually his commitment to honesty about consequences. He told people exactly what would happen if they opposed him, and when they tested his resolve, he proved his word was reliable. This brutal honesty about power dynamics actually created more stability than the comfortable lies that other rulers told. The lesson crystallized for me during our final meeting. Caesar looked me directly in the eyes and said, "A ruler who cannot lie when necessary will be destroyed by those who can. But a ruler who cannot tell the truth when it serves his purpose will be destroyed by his own deceptions." This was the prince's dilemma. Pure honesty leads to political suicide, but pure deception leads to isolation and eventual downfall. The art lies in knowing which tool serves your larger purpose at any given moment. Caesar had mastered this balance, using truth and selective revelation as instruments of statecraft rather than moral absolutes. In watching him, I understood that effective leadership requires the courage to be honest about unpleasant realities, while having the wisdom to time that honesty strategically. The dagger represents not just the threat of force, but the cutting precision required to separate useful truth from destructive revelation. The broken seal of office sits heavy in my memory, representing not just one man's fall, but a pattern I witnessed repeatedly throughout my years in service. Let me tell you about Francesco Vittori, my dear friend and one of the most capable diplomats Florence ever produced, whose commitment to absolute honesty nearly destroyed everything he had worked to build. Vittori possessed what many consider the highest virtue, an unwavering commitment to truth. When Pope Julius II asked him to assess Florence's military capabilities during our conflict with Pisa, Vittori delivered a report of devastating accuracy. He detailed our weaknesses, our shortage of experienced soldiers, the inadequacy of our fortifications, and the genuine limitations of our treasury. Every word was true, every assessment was correct, and every sentence brought him closer to political exile. The Pope, rather than appreciating this honesty, questioned Florence's commitment to the alliance. How could they trust a republic that seemed so weak? Vittori's superiors in Florence, rather than valuing his accurate intelligence, began to see him as the bearer of bad news. And in politics, there is often little distinction between the messenger and the message. I watched as Vittori's reputation shifted from reliable diplomat to pessimistic voice to potential liability. His honesty, which should have been his greatest asset, became a weapon his enemies used against him. They whispered that his reports were too negative, that his assessments damaged Florence's standing, that perhaps he lacked the proper patriotic spirit. The final blow came when Vittori was asked to negotiate a sensitive trade agreement with Venetian merchants. The Venetians were offering terms that appeared favorable on the surface, but contained hidden disadvantages that would become apparent only years later. Vettori saw through their strategy immediately and reported his concerns with characteristic honesty and detail. His analysis was brilliant. His recommendations were sound. His honesty was complete. And his career nearly ended because of it. The Florentine merchants who had been anticipating quick profits from the Venetian deal turned against him. They accused him of sabotaging opportunities through excessive caution. The political leaders who had promised these merchants favorable outcomes found themselves embarrassed by Vettori's inconvenient truths. Rather than address the legitimate concerns he raised, they began to question his judgment and loyalty. What saved Vettori was not a sudden appreciation for his honesty, but his eventual recognition that truth-telling required strategy. He learned to frame his concerns differently, to present problems alongside potential solutions, to give his audiences face-saving alternatives rather than stark confrontations with unpleasant reality. But the damage to his reputation took years to repair. The broken seal represents not just his temporary fall from grace, but the career destruction that awaits anyone who mistakes honesty for wisdom. Truth without timing is career suicide. Accuracy without diplomacy is political death. I learned from Vettori's experience that the most honest person in the room is often the least influential. Power flows not to those who speak truth most clearly, but to those who understand how to make truth palatable and useful to their audiences. The seal breaks when we forget that our role is not just to perceive reality accurately, but to help others accept and act upon that reality effectively. The tragedy is not that honest people like Vettori suffer, it is that their suffering serves no purpose when their honesty is delivered without strategic intelligence. The diplomat's mirror became my most treasured possession during my years, navigating the treacherous waters of Renaissance politics not because of its silver backing or ornate frame, but because it taught me the most crucial lesson of strategic communication, the necessity of showing different faces to different people while maintaining your essential integrity. This mirror had two sides, and I came to understand that effective diplomacy required the same duality. On one side, you had to reflect back to people what they needed to see to trust and work with you. On the other side, you had to maintain a clear view of reality that guided your actual decisions. The art lay not in choosing between truth and deception, but in understanding how to use both in service of your larger purposes. I must distinguish here between harmful lies and strategic omissions, because this distinction determines whether you become a trusted advisor or a despised manipulator. Harmful lies are those told purely for personal gain at others' expense. These will eventually destroy both your reputation and your effectiveness. Strategic omissions, however, are about timing and context, about understanding that not every truth serves every purpose at every moment. When I was negotiating with the French courts regarding Florence's military support, I never lied about our capabilities or intentions, but I certainly emphasized different aspects of our position depending on my audience. To King Louis XII, I emphasized our strategic location and our value as a buffer against other Italian powers. To his military advisors, I focused on our knowledge of local terrain and our network of intelligence contacts. To his financial ministers, I highlighted our trade relationships and economic partnerships. Each conversation was honest, but none was complete. The mirror taught me that completeness is often the enemy of effectiveness. When you tell people everything at once, you overwhelm their ability to process and act. When you reveal information strategically, you help them understand what they need to know, when they need to know it. The most powerful lesson came during a particularly delicate negotiation where Florence needed French military assistance. But the French were reluctant to commit resources to what they saw as a minor regional dispute. I could have been completely honest about our desperate situation. Our treasury was nearly empty. Our military was unprepared, and our enemies were gathering strength. This honesty would have been accurate, but it would have convinced the French that we were a poor investment. Instead, I chose strategic emphasis. I was honest about the strategic importance of our position, accurate about the long-term benefits of alliance, and truthful about our commitment to the partnership. I simply chose not to lead with our vulnerabilities. When questions arose about our immediate capabilities, I redirected the conversation to our proven track record and our plans for improvement. This was not deception. It was strategic communication. I never denied our challenges when directly asked, but I framed them as temporary obstacles rather than permanent weaknesses. The result was an alliance that ultimately benefited both Florence and France, an outcome that complete honesty about our immediate vulnerabilities would have prevented. The mirror reflects back the truth that serves the relationship while maintaining your clear view of the complete picture. The diplomat who shows only one face, whether completely honest or completely deceptive, will find themselves trusted by no one and effective in nothing. True strategic intelligence lies in understanding that trust is built not through complete transparency, but through consistent reliability in the information you choose to share. The courtier's fan became my symbol for the subtle art of reading social dynamics and communicating through gesture and timing, rather than words alone. In the courts of Renaissance Italy, a fan was never merely a tool for cooling oneself, was an instrument of sophisticated communication, capable of conveying complex messages through the angle of its hold, the speed of its movement, and the timing of its deployment. Learning to read the room's hidden currents saved my career more times than I can count. The difference between the honest advisors who thrived and those who found themselves exiled was not the accuracy of their information, but their ability to sense when their honesty would be welcomed and when it would be seen as betrayal. I learned this lesson most clearly during a crucial meeting with Piero Soderini, the Gonfalonier of Florence. Regarding our response to papal military movements near our borders, the intelligence was clear. Pope Julius II was positioning troops for what appeared to be preparation for an assault on Florentine territory. The honest response would have been to present this information immediately and recommend defensive preparations. But as I entered the council chamber, I noticed subtle signs that changed my entire approach. Soderini's posture was more rigid than usual, his hands clasped tightly behind his back rather than resting comfortably on the table. The other advisors were seated farther apart than normal, suggesting recent disagreement. Most tellingly, several council members avoided eye contact when I entered, a clear indication that I was walking into a political minefield, like a courtier reading the messages conveyed by a fan's movement. I adjusted my approach instantly. Rather than leading with the alarming intelligence about papal troop movements, I began by asking about the council's current priorities and concerns. Through careful listening, I discovered that Soderini had just received harsh criticism for his previous military preparations, which had proven unnecessary and expensive. Any advisor who immediately recommended new defensive measures would be seen as either ignorant of the political climate or deliberately inflammatory. Instead, I presented the same information through a different framework. I spoke about the importance of maintaining diplomatic channels with Rome, mentioned the papal troop movements as context for why such diplomacy was particularly crucial at the moment, and suggested that understanding papal intentions through dialogue would be more effective than reactive military preparations. The information was identical. Papal troops were moving and Florence needed to respond. But by reading the room's emotional currents, I was able to present this truth in a way that aligned with, rather than threatened, the existing political dynamics. The result was the same defensive preparations I would have recommended initially, but achieved through a process that strengthened rather than undermined my position. The fan teaches us that timing is everything in strategic communication. A Message delivered when the audience is receptive will be heard and acted upon. The same message delivered when the audience is resistant will be dismissed, regardless of its accuracy or importance. The art lies in developing the sensitivity to detect these subtle shifts in receptivity. Watch for the physical signs. Tight postures suggest defensiveness. Scattered seating indicates recent conflict. Averted gazes signal discomfort with your presence or your likely message. Listen for the verbal cues, topics that are quickly changed, subjects that create unusual silence, phrases that generate subtle tension among your audience. Most importantly, learn to distinguish between temporary resistance and fundamental opposition. Sometimes the room is not ready for truth because of timing stress, recent failure, or competing priorities. In these cases, patience and reframing can eventually create the opening for honest communication. But sometimes the resistance reflects deeper political realities that require a completely different strategic approach. The gilded cage became my metaphor for understanding one of the most counterintuitive aspects of power. The higher someone rises, the more isolated they become from unfiltered truth, and the more they come to depend on the comfortable distortions that preserve their psychological equilibrium. This cage is beautiful, prestigious, and increasingly necessary for their continued functioning, but it separates them from the reality that could save them. I witnessed this phenomenon most clearly during my interactions with Pope Alexander VI. Rodrigo Borgia, whose need for reassuring fiction had become so complete that his advisors competed to provide increasingly elaborate forms of flattery disguised as intelligence. The Pope's daily briefings had evolved into theatrical performances where bad news was softened, delayed, or reframed as opportunities for demonstrating his wisdom and strength. When Spanish territories began resisting papal tax collection, the reports reaching Alexander described this as administrative delays, requiring gentle guidance from His Holiness's superior diplomatic skills. When French cardinals questioned certain papal appointments, this became requests for the Holy Father's clarification of his profound strategic vision. When rumors spread about Cesar Borgia's military setbacks, these transformed into temporary, tactical repositioning that demonstrates the Duke's sophisticated understanding of warfare. The Pope did not demand these comfortable distortions. His advisors provided them because they had learned that uncomfortable truths made him irritable, suspicious, and more likely to blame the messenger than address the message. Over time, a culture developed where bringing accurate but disturbing information became seen as disloyalty or incompetence. What I realized was that these advisors were not simply being deceptive, they were responding to a genuine psychological need. Leaders under extreme pressure often require some degree of emotional protection in order to function. The question is not whether to provide this protection, but how to provide it in ways that serve rather than undermine effective decision-making. The most skilled advisors learned to package unpleasant truths within frameworks that preserved the leader's sense of control and competence. Instead of saying our enemies are stronger than anticipated, they might say this situation provides an opportunity to demonstrate Your Holiness's superior strategic thinking by adapting our approach. The core information is the same, but the framing allows the leader to process it without feeling diminished. I discovered that you could actually serve truth more effectively by understanding and accommodating these psychological needs rather than fighting them. When I needed to inform Florentine leaders about our military weaknesses, I learned to present this information as intelligence that demonstrates your wisdom in seeking to improve our capabilities, rather than as failures or oversights. The key insight is that people in power are not usually stupid or deliberately self-deceptive. They are managing enormous pressures and responsibilities that require tremendous emotional and psychological resources. Information that undermines their confidence or sense of control can actually impair their ability to make necessary decisions. But there is a crucial distinction between supportive framing and actual deception. Supportive framing preserves the leader's psychological equilibrium while delivering accurate information. True deception withholds or distorts information in ways that prevent effective decision-making. The gilded cage becomes dangerous only when it completely separates leaders from reality. The art lies in understanding how to maintain the cage's psychological benefits while ensuring that accurate information still flows through its bars. You can feed their need for validation while serving the greater good by helping them see themselves as wise enough to handle difficult truths and strong enough to make necessary changes. The advisor who learns this balance becomes indispensable not as a flatterer, but as someone who makes truth palatable and actionable. The sundial of opportunity taught me that truth, like sunlight, casts different shadows depending on the hour. The same information that destroys careers when delivered at the wrong moment can build reputations and change entire organizations when shared with perfect timing. Learning to read these temporal dynamics became one of my most valuable skills. I discovered this principle during a crisis involving Florentine grain supplies. Our intelligence indicated that the upcoming harvest would be severely inadequate due to unusual weather patterns, potentially creating food shortages that could lead to civil unrest. This was information that our leaders desperately needed, but the timing of its delivery would determine whether it led to effective preparation or political chaos. My first instinct was to report this immediately after all earlier warning allows for better preparation, but I forced myself to consider the broader context. The city had just emerged from a period of economic uncertainty that had tested public confidence in the government. Citizens were finally beginning to feel secure again, and several major civic projects were moving forward successfully. Additionally, the harvest season was still months away, meaning that immediate action was not required. If I had delivered this alarming prediction during the period of renewed confidence, it would have been seen as unnecessarily pessimistic and potentially destabilizing. The leaders would have wondered whether my intelligence was accurate or whether I was prone to catastrophic thinking. More importantly, early disclosure might have led to premature actions that could have become self-fulfilling prophecies. Instead, I waited for the optimal moment when early signs of potential crop problems began appearing, when our leaders were psychologically prepared to consider challenging scenarios, and when enough time remained for effective countermeasures. By then, my warning was seen not as alarmism, but as valuable foresight. The sundial teaches us that people are more receptive to different types of information at different times. After successes, they are open to new challenges and ambitious initiatives, but resistant to warnings about potential problems. After setbacks, they are receptive to honest assessments and corrective measures, but closed to suggestions for expansion or risk-taking. During periods of stability, people can process complex or nuanced information. During times of crisis, they need clear, simple guidance and reassurance about their ability to handle the situation. During transitions, they are most open to fundamental changes in direction, but least patient with detailed analysis. I learned to map these emotional and psychological cycles like an astronomer tracking celestial movements. When leaders were feeling confident and successful, I would present information about new opportunities or suggest refinements to existing strategies. When they were dealing with recent failures or criticism, I would offer data that helped them understand problems without feeling personally diminished. The most powerful timing involves what I call the wisdom moment, that brief window when someone is emotionally ready to hear truth that they were previously unable to accept. This usually occurs after they have experienced consequences that make the truth impossible to ignore, but before they have become so defensive that they blame external factors rather than examining their own assumptions. During one particularly delicate situation involving Florentine military strategy. I waited nearly 6 months to deliver crucial intelligence about our allies' reliability. The information was accurate from the beginning, but our leaders needed to experience certain disappointments firsthand before they would be psychologically capable of questioning their fundamental assumptions about these partnerships. When I finally shared my assessment, it was received not as criticism but as validation of their growing concerns. The same information delivered earlier would have been dismissed as pessimism or disloyalty. The sundial reminds us that strategic patience is often more valuable than immediate honesty. Truth that arrives at the wrong time serves no one, while truth that arrives at precisely the right moment can transform entire situations. The merchant's scale became my guide for understanding that reputation, like commerce, requires careful balance and strategic investment over time. You cannot simply declare yourself trustworthy and honest. You must build that reputation through a series of calculated truth-telling moments that demonstrate both your reliability and your wisdom. Early in my career, I made the mistake that destroys many honest people. I tried to establish my credibility by being the person who always spoke uncomfortable truths. I thought this would mark me as courageous and insightful. Instead, it marked me as someone who could not read social dynamics and who prioritized my own moral posturing over the organization's needs. The turning point came when I observed Antonello Petrucci, a diplomatic advisor who had managed to build a reputation as both honest and wise, a combination that seemed impossible given what I had witnessed happening to other I studied his approach with the intensity of a merchant, analyzing successful trading strategies. Petrucci's secret was calibration. He understood that reputation is built not through constant truth-telling, but through selective moments of valuable honesty. When he spoke difficult truths, they were always accompanied by practical solutions or alternative approaches. When he identified problems, he also identified opportunities. When he challenged assumptions, he provided better frameworks for thinking about the issues. Most importantly, he established his credibility during low-stakes situations before attempting to influence high-stakes decisions. When minor administrative issues arose, he would quietly provide accurate assessments that proved correct over time. When routine diplomatic intelligence needed interpretation, he would offer analysis that consistently demonstrated insight. By the time major crises emerged, his track record had earned him the right to be heard even when his message was unwelcome. I began implementing this approach systematically. Rather than jumping immediately into controversial territory, I focused on building a foundation of reliable, useful intelligence on smaller matters. When colleagues made predictions that I knew were unrealistic, I did not contradict them directly. Instead, I would ask thoughtful questions that helped them discover the flaws in their reasoning themselves. When I did offer alternative perspectives, I framed them as supplements rather than contradictions. That approach has significant merit, and I wonder if we might also consider, or building on that excellent insight, what if we also examined? This allowed me to introduce different viewpoints without triggering defensive responses. Taught me that truth-telling is most effective when it feels collaborative rather than confrontational. People are more likely to accept honest feedback when they feel that you are working with them rather than against them. When your insights help them succeed rather than expose their failures. I learned to present problems alongside solutions, criticisms alongside acknowledgements of existing strengths, and warnings alongside expressions of confidence in our ability to handle challenges. This approach made my honesty feel supportive rather than threatening, valuable rather than destructive. The key breakthrough came when I realized that my role was not to be the person who always told the truth, but to be the person who helped others see truth in ways that enabled effective action. Sometimes this meant direct statements, but more often it meant strategic questions, alternative frameworks, or gradual revelation of information that allowed people to reach accurate conclusions themselves. Over time, this approach created a reputation that was far more powerful than simple honesty. I became known as someone whose insights were worth hearing, whose questions revealed important considerations, and whose perspective helped improve decision-making. When I did need to deliver difficult truths directly, my track record had earned me the credibility to be heard and the trust to be believed. The merchant scale reminds us that reputation is built through accumulated value over time, not through single dramatic gestures of truth-telling. Each interaction is an investment in your credibility. Make sure the return justifies the cost. The monk's vow of silence taught me one of the most counterintuitive lessons of strategic communication. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing at all. In a world where everyone competes to be heard, the person who knows when to remain quiet often gains the greatest influence and insight. I learned this during a particularly tense council meeting where Florentine leaders were debating our response to Venetian territorial encroachments. The room was filled with passionate voices, each council member eager to demonstrate their wisdom and commitment through increasingly elaborate proposals for military action, diplomatic protests, and economic retaliation. My initial instinct was to contribute my own analysis. I had spent considerable time studying Venetian motivations and had developed what I believed was a superior strategy. But something in the dynamics of the room made me hesitate. There was an emotional charge to the discussion that suggested logic and analysis would not be welcome. More importantly, I sensed that the various council members were revealing far more about their true positions and motivations than they realized. So I remained silent, and in that silence, I gained intelligence that no amount of direct questioning could have provided. I watched as alliances formed and dissolved based on subtle reactions to different proposals. I observed which council members were genuinely committed to aggressive action and which were merely performing for political effect. Most valuable of all, I saw how each participant revealed their own weaknesses and blind spots through their eagerness to speak. One council member's repeated emphasis on military solutions revealed his insecurity about being perceived as weak. Another's focus on economic measures exposed his family's financial interests in Venetian trade. A third's diplomatic suggestions showed his fundamental misunderstanding of Venetian political structure. Each revelation came not through direct confession, but through the unconscious admissions that emerge when people feel compelled to fill silence with words. When the meeting finally turned to me for input, my period of strategic listening had provided me with a complete map of the political terrain. I was able to craft a response that addressed each participant's underlying concerns, while advancing what I believed was the most effective policy approach. More importantly, my initial silence had marked me as thoughtful and measured, than simply another voice competing for attention. The monk's vow teaches us that silence creates space for others to reveal themselves while protecting us from premature commitments or unnecessary conflicts. In professional environments, the person who rushes to speak often loses the opportunity to understand the real dynamics at play. The person who listens strategically can identify allies, opponents, and opportunities that remain invisible to those focused on making themselves heard. Strategic silence also serves as a form of intellectual protection. When you do not immediately reveal your position, you cannot be immediately attacked or dismissed. You maintain flexibility to adapt your approach based on information that emerges from others' contributions. You avoid the trap of defending preliminary thoughts that may need refinement as discussions evolve. Perhaps most importantly, strategic silence often prompts others to fill the void with increasingly revealing statements. People become uncomfortable with extended quiet and will often share information or perspectives they had not intended to reveal. The person who remains calm and attentive during these moments gains access to intelligence that direct questions could never extract. I have watched careers destroyed by people who felt compelled to have an opinion on every topic and to share that opinion immediately. Their constant commentary marked them as shallow thinkers who prioritized appearing knowledgeable over actually understanding complex situations. In contrast, those who spoke less frequently but with greater insight gained reputations for wisdom and depth. The key is learning to distinguish between silence born of ignorance and silence born of strategy. Strategic silence requires active engagement, careful observation, thoughtful analysis, and patient accumulation of information. It is not passive withdrawal, but intentional positioning for maximum effectiveness when speech becomes necessary. When you do break strategic silence, your words carry greater weight because they have been earned through demonstrated thoughtfulness, rather than claimed through volume or frequency of contribution. The confessor's booth became my symbol for understanding that even in a world where strategic communication rules, there must be sacred spaces where complete honesty can flow safely. These relationships are not built quickly or casually. They require careful cultivation and absolute discretion, but they become the foundation upon which all other strategic communication rests. I discovered this necessity during my darkest period, after the return of the Medici to Florence and my subsequent imprisonment on charges of conspiracy. Stripped of my official position, under suspicion of treason, and facing possible execution, I found myself completely isolated from the normal channels of political communication. It was during this crisis that I learned the true value of relationships, built on mutual honesty rather than strategic advantage. Francesco Guicciardini became my confessor in this period, though neither of us would have used such religious language at the time. Our correspondence during my exile created a space where I could express my genuine fears, analyze political situations without regard for who might be listening, and receive honest feedback about my prospects and options. What made these exchanges possible was the foundation we had built over years of smaller, honest moments. When Guicciardini had faced criticism for his handling of papal negotiations, I had provided private counsel that prioritized his success over my own advancement. When I had struggled with strategic decisions regarding French alliances, he had offered analysis that contradicted his own public positions but served my actual needs. This pattern of private honesty in service of each other's interests created a bond that transcended immediate political calculations. We each knew that the other would provide accurate information and genuine insight regardless of broader strategic considerations. This trust became invaluable when official channels of communication were compromised or unreliable. The confessor's booth teaches us that strategic truth-telling requires at least some relationships, where strategy can be temporarily set aside. Without these connections, you lose access to the honest feedback necessary for accurate self-assessment and effective decision-making. You become trapped in your own strategic communications, unable to distinguish between the roles you play and the reality you face. But building these relationships requires immense care and patience. You cannot simply declare someone your confessor. You must prove your trustworthiness through consistent demonstration of discretion and loyalty. More importantly, you must be willing to provide the same level of honest feedback that you hope to receive, even when it is uncomfortable or politically inconvenient. I learned to identify potential confessor relationships by observing how people handled confidential information in low-stakes situations. Did they repeat gossip for social advantage? Did they use private information to position themselves politically? Did they maintain confidences even when breaking them might provide short-term benefits? These small tests revealed character in ways that formal diplomatic interactions never could. The most valuable confessor relationships were often built around shared vulnerabilities rather than shared strengths. When Guicciardini and I both faced criticism for our handling of different diplomatic missions, Our mutual understanding of professional pressure created a bond that transcended our official roles. We each needed someone who understood the specific challenges of our positions and could provide guidance without judgment. These relationships also served as crucial reality checks on my strategic communications with others. After important meetings or negotiations, I could process the interactions honestly with someone who had no agenda beyond helping me understand what had actually occurred versus what I hoped had occurred. The confessor's booth reminds us that even the most skilled strategic communicators need spaces where they can drop their masks and examine their true situations clearly. Without these relationships, strategic communication becomes performance art, impressive perhaps, but ultimately disconnected from the reality it is supposed to serve. The key is maintaining absolute separation between your confessor relationships and your strategic communications. The moment you begin using private, honest feedback to gain political advantage, you destroy the trust that makes such relationships possible. The booth's sanctity depends on its complete separation from the outside world. The Trojan horse taught me one of the most ruthless lessons in strategic truth-telling. Sometimes your greatest advantage comes not from enlightening your opponents, but from allowing them to remain trapped in their comfortable misconceptions. While you should never lie to allies or potential partners, letting enemies believe what they want to believe can provide decisive strategic advantages. I witnessed this principle most clearly during Florence's complex negotiations with the Papal States regarding territorial boundaries in the Rome. Pope Julius II had developed a fixed belief that Florentine military capabilities were far greater than they actually were, based partly on exaggerated reports from his own advisors and partly on his desire to justify his cautious approach to direct confrontation with us. The reality was that Florence's military position was precarious. Our treasury was strained, our fortifications needed significant improvements, and our alliance network was fragile. Any direct military confrontation with Papal forces would have been disastrous for us. But the Pope's inflated assessment of our strength was actually protecting us more effectively than any army could have. My first instinct was to correct these misconceptions during our diplomatic exchanges. After all, honest communication should lead to better outcomes for all parties, and the Pope's overestimation of our capabilities was based on false information. But then I realized that his comfortable delusion was serving our interests far better than truth would have. As long as Julius believed we were militarily formidable, he would continue seeking diplomatic rather than military solutions to our territorial disputes. His caution, born of misconception, gave us time to actually build the capabilities he already believed we possessed. His hesitation, based on imaginary threats, allowed us to strengthen our position until fiction could become reality. The key insight was understanding the difference between deceptive communication and simply refraining from corrective communication. I never told Julius that our military was stronger than it was, simply did not volunteer information about our weaknesses. When he made statements that revealed his inflated assessment of our capabilities, I neither confirmed nor denied them. I allowed his assumptions to remain unchallenged. This approach required tremendous discipline, because there were moments when correcting his misconceptions might have provided short-term diplomatic advantages. If I had revealed our actual military situation, I might have been able to negotiate more favorable terms in specific agreements by appealing to his sense of magnanimity toward a weaker neighbor. But the long-term strategic advantage of his continued caution far outweighed any immediate tactical gains from honesty. As long as he overestimated our strength, we maintained leverage that truth would have destroyed. The Trojan horse worked not because it was deceptive, but because it allowed the Trojans to deceive themselves. The principle extends beyond military situations to any competitive environment. When rivals overestimate your capabilities, underestimate your ambitions, or misunderstand your strategies. Their misconceptions can provide significant advantages. The temptation to correct them, to demonstrate your intelligence by showing that you understand the situation more clearly than they do, can destroy valuable strategic positions. This does not mean actively deceiving opponents, which carries significant risks and ethical problems. It means understanding that you have no obligation to enlighten those who are working against your interests, especially when their ignorance serves broader purposes. The horse reminds us that sometimes the greatest victory comes not from superior force, but from allowing enemies to defeat themselves through their own assumptions and blindness. Truth is a powerful weapon, but it should be aimed carefully toward those who can become allies, not those who will always remain opponents. The banker's ledger became my guide for understanding that modern organizational politics operate on the same fundamental principles that governed Renaissance city-states, but with structures that require more sophisticated navigation strategies, like the Medici, who built their power through carefully managed networks of obligation and influence rather than formal authority. Today's successful professionals must learn to create value across multiple organizational levels simultaneously. During my years observing Lorenzo de' Medici, I learned that his true power came not from his official titles, which were actually quite modest, but from his systematic cultivation of relationships that created mutual dependency and shared interest. His ledger recorded not just financial transactions, but political debts, strategic investments in people's careers, and careful balancing of competing factions within Florence's complex social structure. The modern equivalent of this approach requires understanding that your career advancement depends not just on your direct supervisor's satisfaction, but on your ability to create value for people across the organizational hierarchy. You must manage up by making your boss successful, manage down by developing the capabilities of those you supervise, and manage across by building alliances with peers who can become future collaborators or decision-makers. The banker's ledger teaches us to think systematically about these relationships as investments that require both patience and strategic thinking. When you help a colleague solve a problem that serves their interests, you create a form of political capital that may become valuable months or years later. When you provide your supervisor with insights that help them succeed with their own leadership, you become indispensable to their continued advancement. But the modern Medici principle requires understanding the unwritten rules that govern how influence actually flows within contemporary organizations. Official org charts rarely reflect the actual networks of influence and decision-making authority. The person with the most impressive title may have less real power than someone 3 levels down, who has built strong relationships across multiple departments. I learned to map these hidden power structures by observing whose opinions were solicited during important decisions, whose emails received immediate responses, and whose suggestions were implemented even when they were not formally responsible for the relevant areas. Like Lorenzo studying Florence's merchant families, I tracked which individuals had the ability to make things happen regardless of their formal position. The ledger also taught me the importance of strategic reciprocity, understanding that influence is built through patterns of mutual benefit rather than one-sided transactions. When you consistently provide value to others without immediately expecting returns, you build the kind of reputation that makes people want to help you succeed. But this requires careful balance between generosity and self-advocacy. Modern organizations, like Renaissance city-states, are fundamentally coalitional structures where competing interests must be balanced and managed. Your success depends not just on your individual capabilities, but on your ability to position yourself within these coalitions effectively. This means understanding the broader political dynamics that shape organizational priorities and aligning your contributions with those larger forces The most successful application of the Medici principle involves becoming what I call a villainized. Connect to someone who helps others achieve their objectives while advancing your own interests. When you become known as a person who can help others navigate organizational challenges, solve complex problems, or build useful relationships, you develop the kind of influence that transcends formal authority. This approach requires the same sophisticated understanding of human psychology that guided the Medici banking empire. You must understand what motivates different types of people, what kinds of value they prize most highly, and how to frame your contributions in ways that resonate with their particular priorities and concerns. The ledger reminds us that organizational politics, like Renaissance statecraft, is ultimately about creating and managing networks of mutual obligation and shared interest. The person who masters these dynamics can exercise influence far beyond what their formal position would suggest. Just as the Medici shaped European politics from their banker's table in Florence, the carrier pigeon became my symbol for understanding that in every organization, the most valuable information flows through informal channels that operate parallel to official communication systems. These networks, built on trust, mutual benefit, and carefully maintained discretion, often provide more accurate intelligence about organizational dynamics than any formal reporting structure. I learned this during my early diplomatic missions, when I discovered that the most crucial information about foreign courts never appeared in official dispatches. The real intelligence about shifting alliances, emerging conflicts, and leadership vulnerabilities traveled through networks of trusted contacts who shared information precisely because it could not be shared through formal channels. Building these networks required a completely different set of skills than formal diplomacy. Official communications were bound by protocol, political considerations, and the need to maintain diplomatic fiction. Informal networks, however, operated on principles of genuine mutual value and personal trust that transcended immediate political calculations. The key insight was understanding that these whisper networks serve essential functions that formal communication systems cannot fulfill. They provide early warning about organizational changes, reveal the real reasons behind official decisions, and offer access to perspectives that would never be shared in formal meetings or official communications. During one crucial period, when Florence was navigating complex alliances with both French and Papal forces, my official intelligence sources provided contradictory and often misleading information. Each party had political reasons to misrepresent their true intentions and capabilities, but through carefully cultivated informal contacts, French bishop's secretary who shared my interest in classical literature, a papal guard who had grown up in the same region as my family, gained access to intelligence that proved decisive. For our strategic planning, these relationships worked because they were built on genuine personal connections rather than pure transactional exchanges. The bishop's secretary and I had spent hours discussing Cicero and Plutarch before we ever shared politically sensitive information. The papal guard and I had bonded over shared memories of our homeland's local customs and dialect. These human connections created the trust necessary for honest information sharing. The carrier pigeon teaches us that information wants to flow, but it flows most freely through channels that feel safe and personally meaningful. People will share insights with those they trust and like that they would never reveal through formal channels. No matter how logical or beneficial such sharing might be, building an effective whisper network requires three essential elements: demonstrated trustworthiness, genuine personal connection, and reciprocal value creation. You must prove over time that you protect confidential information scrupulously, that you value the person beyond their utility as an information source, and that you provide insights and assistance that help them succeed in their own objectives. Most valuable whisper networks are often built around shared experiences that create natural bonds. People who have worked together under pressure, who have faced similar professional challenges, or who share personal interests that extend beyond immediate work relationships. These connections provide the emotional foundation that makes honest information sharing feel natural rather than risky. But maintaining these networks requires constant attention and care. Like carrier pigeons, they must be fed regularly with valuable information, protected from predators who might exploit the relationships, and given clear directions about what kinds of messages they should carry and to whom. The most sophisticated practitioners learn to participate in multiple whisper networks simultaneously while maintaining strict boundaries between them. Information received from one network should never be shared with another unless explicitly permitted, and the existence of your various information sources should be protected as carefully as state secrets. These networks often provide the most accurate assessment of organizational health, leadership effectiveness, and emerging opportunities or threats. They reveal the gap between public statements and private reality, between official strategy and actual implementation, between formal authority and real influence. The court jester's mask taught me one of the most delicate arts in organizational survival: how to maintain genuine relationships and authentic values, while performing the enthusiasm and loyalty that institutions demand. Like the jester who could speak truth to power only by wrapping it in entertainment and apparent devotion, the modern professional must learn to navigate the performance expectations that govern organizational life. I discovered this necessity during my service under Piero Soderini, the Gonfalonier of Florence, whose leadership style required constant affirmation and visible enthusiasm from his advisors. Soderini was not a bad leader, but he needed to see evidence of personal loyalty and institutional commitment from those around him. Providing accurate analysis and effective counsel was not enough. It had to be delivered within a framework of apparent devotion to his vision and the Republic's mission. The challenge was maintaining my intellectual integrity and genuine commitment to Florence's welfare, while providing the emotional performance that Soderini required. I learned to separate the substance of my advice from the style of its delivery, ensuring that my actual counsel remained accurate and valuable, while wrapping it in the kind of enthusiastic support that made Soderini receptive to hearing it. This was not simple flattery or dishonest manipulation. Rather, it was understanding that leaders like Soderini needed emotional validation in order to process challenging information effectively. When I presented concerning intelligence about Venetian military movements, I would frame it as crucial information that demonstrates your wisdom in maintaining our vigilance, rather than as criticism of our current defensive posture. The mask teaches us that organizational loyalty is often as much about style as substance. People need to feel that you are emotionally invested in their success and the organization's mission, even when you are providing feedback that challenges current approaches or identifies serious problems. The key distinction is between performing enthusiasm for the organization's stated goals and performing agreement with every specific decision or strategy. You can demonstrate genuine commitment to the institution's welfare while maintaining space for honest analysis of particular policies or approaches. I learned to express this through what I came to think of as loyal opposition, showing clear emotional investment in our shared objectives while providing thoughtful critique of our methods for achieving them. When Florence's military strategy needed adjustment, I would emphasize my commitment to the Republic's security, while suggesting improvements to our tactical approach. The performance of loyalty also requires understanding the specific emotional needs of your organizational culture. Some leaders need to see excitement and energy. Others prefer calm competence and steady reliability. Some organizations value innovation and questioning. Others prize consistency and tradition. The mask must be shaped to fit the particular expectations of your environment. But maintaining authenticity within this performance requires careful boundaries. You must identify your core values and non-negotiable principles, then find ways to honor those while still meeting organizational expectations for enthusiasm and commitment. When there is genuine conflict between your values and institutional demands, the mask becomes insufficient protection. During my later years, when the Medici returned to power and I found myself serving under a completely different political system, I had to develop new forms of performance, while maintaining my essential commitments to effective governance and Florentine welfare. The specific style of loyalty required had changed dramatically, but the underlying need to demonstrate emotional investment remained constant. The most successful practitioners learned to make their performance feel natural and sustainable, rather than forced or exhausting. This requires finding genuine points of connection with organizational goals and leadership approaches, then amplifying those authentic feelings rather than manufacturing false ones. The jester's mask reminds us that even the most honest truth must understand the emotional and psychological context within which their honesty will be received. Truth delivered without appropriate emotional packaging often fails to achieve its intended effect, regardless of its accuracy or importance. The art lies in learning to perform organizational loyalty in ways that enhance rather than compromise your ability to provide valuable counsel and maintain authentic relationships with colleagues and leadership. The architect's blueprint became my guide for understanding that meaningful organizational change requires the same long-term planning and systematic approach that guides the construction of great buildings. Like an architect who must consider foundation, structure, and environment before beginning construction, the reformer must build influence and credibility slowly while maintaining their position within the system they seek to improve. I learned this lesson through painful experience during my early attempts to reform Florence's military organization. I had identified serious weaknesses in our reliance on mercenary forces and had developed comprehensive plans for creating a citizen militia that would be more reliable and cost-effective. My analysis was accurate, my proposals were practical, and my recommendations would have significantly strengthened the Republic's security. But I made the fundamental error of presenting these reforms as urgent necessities rather than gradual improvements. I emphasized the failures of our current system rather than building on its partial successes. I challenged entrenched interests directly rather than finding ways to align reform with their existing motivations. The result was resistance, suspicion, and ultimately the failure of necessary changes that could have prevented later disasters. The blueprint taught me that sustainable reform requires three essential phases: foundation building, structural development, and systematic implementation. You cannot begin with structural changes until you have built the foundation of trust and credibility that makes people willing to consider alternatives to current approaches. Foundation building means establishing yourself as someone who understands and appreciates the existing system's strengths, while also being capable of identifying opportunities for improvement. This requires years of patient engagement with current processes, learning why things work the way they do, and building relationships with people who have investments in existing approaches. During this phase, I learned to propose small improvements that enhanced rather than threatened current operations. When I identified inefficiencies in our diplomatic communication systems, I suggested refinements that made existing procedures work better rather than proposing entirely new approaches. These small successes built my reputation as someone who could improve organizational effectiveness without creating disruption. Structural development involves gradually introducing larger changes that build on the foundation of trust and small successes you have established. This is where the architect's skill becomes crucial. You must sequence your reforms so that each change creates conditions that make the next change more likely to succeed. When I finally succeeded in implementing military reforms, it was because I had spent years building support among key stakeholders, demonstrating the value of my approach through small pilot programs, and aligning my proposals with broader political objectives that leadership already supported. The reforms looked like natural evolution rather than revolutionary change. The blueprint also taught me the importance of what I call protective patience, understanding that premature advocacy for necessary changes can actually delay their implementation by creating opposition that did not previously exist. Sometimes the greatest service to your reform agenda is waiting until conditions are more favorable for its acceptance. During the period when Florence was dealing with external military threats, any proposal that appeared to weaken our immediate defensive capabilities, even temporarily, would have been seen as dangerous or unpatriotic. I learned to wait for periods when security concerns were less pressing before advancing reforms that required short-term adjustments to achieve long-term improvements. Strategic patience also means understanding that your role as a reformer may be to lay groundwork that others will eventually build upon rather than to see all your proposed changes implemented during your own tenure. Like an architect whose vision may take decades to complete, you must be willing to invest in changes that may not reach fruition until after you have moved on to other responsibilities. The most important insight from the architect's blueprint is that lasting reform requires changing people's understanding and expectations gradually rather than challenging their fundamental assumptions directly. When people feel that their existing knowledge and experience have value within your proposed changes, they become allies rather than obstacles to improvement. The traveler's map became my most sobering teacher, showing me that sometimes the most honest assessment of any situation is recognizing when it has become so toxic that honest people cannot survive within it. Not every organization can be reformed. Not every leader can be influenced, and not every political environment allows for the kind of strategic truth-telling that serves both individual advancement and institutional improvement. I learned this lesson most painfully when the Medici returned to Florence in 1512, bringing with them a complete transformation of the political culture I had navigated successfully for 14 years. The new regime was not simply different, it was actively hostile to the kind of analytical independence and institutional loyalty that had defined my career under the Republic. The map taught me to recognize the warning signs that indicate when an organization has moved beyond the reach of strategic influence, when truth-telling of any kind becomes dangerous, when competence is seen as a threat rather than an asset, when loyalty to institutional mission is interpreted as disloyalty to personal authority. The environment has become unsurvivable for people committed to honest excellence. The first sign is when accurate information consistently provokes anger rather than gratitude. Under the Republic, even unwelcome intelligence was valued for its utility in decision-making. Under the new Medici regime, reports that contradicted leadership preferences were seen as evidence of opposition or inadequate enthusiasm for the new order. The second warning appears when asking thoughtful questions is interpreted as questioning authority. In healthy organizations, leaders welcome probing analysis that helps them understand complex situations more clearly. In toxic environments, any inquiry that might reveal problems or complications is seen as undermining leadership confidence. The third and most decisive indicator emerges when competence itself becomes politically suspect, when your effectiveness at your actual job responsibilities makes others uncomfortable, when your track record of success is treated as evidence of potential disloyalty, when excellence is seen as a form of criticism of mediocrity. The organization has become fundamentally hostile to the kind of people who create real value. The traveler's map showed me that recognizing these conditions early provides crucial advantages in planning your departure. When you wait until the environment has become completely impossible, you are forced to leave in crisis mode, often under circumstances that damage your reputation and limit your future options. Strategic departure requires the same careful planning and patience that characterizes all effective truth-telling. You must begin building external relationships and alternative opportunities. While you still have credibility and leverage within your current position, you must document your contributions and achievements while they can still be framed positively rather than defensively. Most importantly, you must resist the temptation to use your departure as an opportunity for dramatic truth-telling about organizational problems. The satisfaction of telling them what you really think is almost never worth the professional damage it creates. Strategic exit means leaving in ways that preserve your reputation and maintain relationships that may prove valuable in future roles. During my own forced departure from government service, I made the mistake of allowing bitterness and frustration to shape my initial response. This emotional reaction, while understandable, created unnecessary enemies and complicated my eventual return to influence. The map taught me that departure should be treated as a strategic maneuver rather than an emotional release. The most successful exits involve what I learned to call graceful repositioning, framing your departure as pursuit of new opportunities rather than escape from current problems. This approach preserves relationships, maintains your professional reputation, and often creates possibilities for future collaboration under different circumstances. The traveler's map also reminds us that departure does not mean defeat. Sometimes leaving a toxic environment is the most honest assessment of your own capabilities and values. Continuing to work in organizations that have become hostile to excellence serves neither your interests nor the broader cause of effective governance. The goal is to preserve your ability to contribute value in environments where such contributions can be welcomed and utilized effectively. Sometimes strategic retreat is the most intelligent form of strategic advance. The philosopher's quill represents the ultimate purpose of all strategic truth-telling, not personal advancement for its own sake, but the creation of lasting positive change through the intelligent application of honesty and wisdom. After decades of navigating the treacherous waters of Renaissance politics, I have come to understand that the highest form of strategic intelligence lies in serving truth through effectiveness rather than through martyrdom. The quill reminds me that my legacy and yours will be measured not by the purity of our honesty, but by the positive outcomes we were able to achieve through our strategic application of truth and influence. The advisor who destroys their career through premature truth-telling serves no one. The professional who builds influence through strategic communication can serve truth for decades. This is the fundamental insight that transforms strategic truth-telling from manipulation into service. When you master these arts in order to create value for others and advance worthy causes, you become an instrument of positive change rather than mere personal advancement. The techniques I have shared become tools of leadership rather than tools of deception. Throughout my career, I have watched honest people destroy their ability to do good through their commitment to immediate transparency. I have also watched dishonest people achieve temporary success through manipulation that ultimately served no purpose beyond their own narrow interests. The path I advocate requires the discipline to reject both extremes in favor of strategic service to larger purposes. The most successful practitioners of strategic truth-telling use their influence to create organizations and cultures where honesty can flourish more freely. They build trust that makes direct communication more possible. They create safety that allows others to share important information without fear. They establish norms that reward valuable truth-telling while discouraging destructive or Revelation: when you mastered the arts I have described, you gain the ability to gradually reshape the environments in which you operate. Your strategic patience creates space for others to be more honest. Your thoughtful timing helps important truths find receptive audiences. Your careful relationship building creates networks through which valuable information can flow more freely. This is how strategic truth-telling becomes a force for institutional improvement rather than mere personal success. You use your understanding of human psychology and organizational dynamics to make truth more powerful rather than more dangerous. You become someone who helps others succeed through honesty, rather than someone who succeeds despite others' dishonesty. The quill also represents the long-term perspective that must guide all strategic communication. The techniques that serve you in individual interactions must also serve the broader cause of creating organizations and societies where truth can be spoken more freely and effectively. This requires thinking beyond immediate tactical advantages, to consider the cultural and institutional legacy of your approach. When you demonstrate that strategic truth-telling can achieve better outcomes than either pure honesty or pure manipulation, you provide a model that others can follow. When you show that thoughtful timing and careful framing make important truths more rather than less influential, you advance the cause of truth itself. The greatest practitioners become teachers and mentors who help others learn these arts in service of worthy purposes. They create cultures where strategic intelligence enhances rather than compromises institutional integrity. They build organizations where people can serve truth through effectiveness rather than through sacrifice. This is my final counsel. Master these techniques not to become more successful at deception, but to become more effective at truth. Use strategic intelligence to serve honesty rather than to replace it. Build influence in order to create environments where important truths can be spoken and heard more readily. The philosopher's quill endures because it serves purposes beyond the hand that holds it. Your strategic truth-telling will create lasting value only if it serves purposes beyond your own advancement. When it does, you become part of the eternal conversation between wisdom and power, truth and influence, individual excellence and collective good. This is the legacy worthy of your intelligence and effort. Not perfect honesty in a single moment, but strategic service to truth across a lifetime of influence and positive change.